So what do you guys think is the formation of the special interest groups, the death of the SLSA meeting? Doing all the work
No,
meetings, and I'm kidding, but
yeah. No, I mean, I do think that these meetings will probably calm down after a few weeks. Um, uh, I think these meetings will probably, calm down after, once we hit 1.0 or whatever. I'm sure it'll probably go mostly back to where it was until, probably spin it back up every now and again for some big pushes. But yeah, I think that the big thing is just making sure that we have that aligned vision for 1.0.
yeah, I mean, I think these meetings are awesome because we're getting work done and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff for sure. So
Cool.
So
Yeah.
1.0 is still the specifications, right? Only these are the final specs.
For 1. Yeah, so the idea is we're getting ready for the 1.0 release, which will be the specification itself, so the requirements and any sort of modifications that need to be made to the provenance spec. So that's what Mark is leading up, and then the meeting that Melba's been leading up is the positioning, which is just trying to make sure that, like, given that even just was it yesterday or whatever, there's even another supply chain framework that has come out. Like, what can we do to sort of align that work, make sure that it maps well together? Obviously there's always going to be more than one, but we want to make sure that generally we're not saying anything that's just completely out of that other people are not also saying. And so we're doing that, and then also trying to see where we can get in with some folks in the government, make sure that they understand salsa and those sorts of things. And by government, I mean US government, but also world governments in general, as they're also, I believe the European Union is also starting to pull that up. And then the tooling meeting is then just, saying, hey, what can we do to start really hitting like some of the features that maybe are missing in some of the tools that are out there. So I put the document in the notes. Feel free to add yourself. Cool. Yeah, so before we get to the actual agenda, oh, sure, I can add you. Oh, somebody already did. So before we get to any specific agenda, is there anybody new who wants to introduce themselves, or anybody with any major updates?
Yeah, I'll go. This is Eric Tice. Mike, you and I talked about me helping you with this, but I never saw any email and I missed the Slack saying when the meeting started. So I apologize for not being more proactive. I work for Wipro Technologies. I am the Director of Technical Consulting, and I run our Center of Excellence for the OSPO team. And hopefully can get more involved in this here in the near future.
Cool. My name is David Dillard. I work for Veritas Technologies in the product security group.
Cool. Sebastian?
Thank you. I'm Sebastian Crane. I'm coming in from the SPDX angle and very interested in the provenance aspects of SLSA. Awesome.
Okay. I believe everybody else has been here before. Or actually,
I'm new.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
That's all right. I'm Eric Herget. I'm at Red Hat on the product security supply chain team, and so I'm interested in getting involved in SLSA somehow, and the tools piece of it looked like a good place to go. I come from a technical background, so that's why I'm here.
Cool. Glad to have you. So before we get to any items on the agenda, does anybody have any sort of updates or anything else that they wanted to bring up from the tooling perspective? All right, so we can get to the agenda. So there's really only one big item on the agenda today, which was so for folks, because I do see that there's a few new folks. The past few weeks, what we've been doing is we've been sort of splitting stuff out into categories. For like the different sort of tooling categories. So this is stuff like salsa builders and producers of the actual salsa metadata, or things that generate the salsa metadata, distribution and discovery of that sort of metadata, and then stuff like verification and decisioning. So things like that can actually verify the right things are signed the right ways, and that can also make policy decisions, or perhaps tools that can also audit against a salsa claim, like, oh, let's go back and check, does that make sense that claim is being made? And then also then there's kind of like a couple other categories that are more just like integrations. So like, how are we integrating with other package ecosystems, right? So certain things like the SigStore world can very easily integrate with OCI, but there's stuff like that NPM, right, announced that they're going to be using SigStore plus Salsa for some of their stuff. And so what can we do to start integrating, maybe some Salsa stuff into NPM or that sort of thing? Then there's another category, which is just more like, are there any things that we should be doing to set up the adoption team for a good time, so that, when it comes to sort of writing up documentation of like getting started with Salsa and that sort of thing. And then there's sort of just general other tools, which, and so all this stuff, actually, I realize I'm not sharing my screen here. So let me go in, move this over, share screen. Give me 1 second to move this over. But anyway, the other one is like other tooling that's related. So these are things like Scorecard and generally like SBOM, like how are we integrating with other SBOM tooling, or do we need to, that kind of thing. I don't know what just happened to all my tabs here. All right. All right, and then finally, there was some stuff regarding how we want to, how did we want to, I don't know why it's not working for me right now, but so the other one finally was also endemic tools that might have gaps. So these are things like, Jenkins, for example, right? Like I know there's a few different people who are working on Jenkins plugins to generate Salsa provenance, but are there additional things that are perhaps gaps? Are there things that we should also be doing from the perspective of like, here's how you run Jenkins in order to make it Salsa compliant? Because like, a lot of the stuff today, right, is Jenkins sort of lets you easily sort of shift builds and whatever, which would kind of prevent it from sort of higher level Salsa levels, unless you're restricting that sort of thing. So that's really kind of where we kind of split some of that stuff up. I noticed Naveen's not on, but he's been working on sort of building out a Google Sheets, a spreadsheet for that stuff. And let me try this one more time. I think this is, yeah, okay, that should be good. You can see the notes, right?
Yeah.
I can see them.
The comments, notes.
Okay. Cool. So yeah, that's kind of where we ended up. We had done a little bit of prioritization, and last week we kind of came down to looking at distribution as discovery as one of the big sort of gaps, right? We do have a bunch of different tools in the build and production that are already sort of pretty far along. There's a lot of folks in this group and other groups that are doing stuff like, there's the Salsa GitHub generator, there's ones for GitLab, there's using GitHub Actions and Google Cloud Build, there's Tekton, there's Fresca, there's a bunch of different things. If you have a tool that also does this, feel free to add it onto the list. But when it came to distribution and discovery, there is kind of a gap, right? Because we have verification and decisioning, right? We have tools like Cosign. We have a bunch of tools that can actually verify. We have a bunch of the SigStore stuff. We have things like Hiverno, which can use emission control policy, all that good stuff. But when it comes to actually sort of saying, like we have two problems. One is distribution of the Salsa provenance in things that are outside of OCI. So these are things like NPM packages, Python packages, random files. Some of that information is being stored in Recore, but it's not the easiest to sort of discover, right? If you have like, if you want to go and say, okay, well, I just downloaded a file. Is it in Recore? The only way to sort of do that today is just sort of via the hash. And if somebody hasn't recorded it to Recore, but they've recorded it somewhere else, it's impossible to sort of discover. So that's kind of where we kind of landed, is like, how do we sort of figure that sort of thing out? Actually, let me edit the link here. We just renamed it. And so there's a couple of tools, right? Cosign can help out with OCI because it just sort of looks for the thing alongside the package. There was some discussion about Tough, because Tough makes it easy to sort of distribute the root of trust so that you can actually do the distribution and discovery of the keys. And then, today, right, a lot of stuff is potentially you could just store the file somewhere, and if folks know where the file should live or some sort of convention for the naming scheme of the file, you can do that. Okay, so that's where we ended up. Want to get folks' thoughts on where we were what folks wanted to sort of focus on here. If there's any sort of big things in that sort of distribution and discovery, like if there's areas of the specific tools that you think need to have a feature, or if there's a tool that's not listed that should be listed, if there's a tool that doesn't exist that you think, hey, it would be really cool if there was a tool that did this, and we can make guys around building that tool.
I think so one thing that's kind of been swirling around my mind, I think I was talking about it in the last meeting I was in maybe 2 weeks ago, related to what do we do about the metadata? And I think we have some of that decisioning below, right, for the tooling, but I think the higher value of Salsa is actually like, sure, like the metadata exists, but what action should we take on that? So I think that's a major focus of mine, to think about kind of the higher level value of Salsa as well. So that's just one thing I'd underscore.
Sure. Yeah, there's definitely, I think, a sort of a nice relationship between the distribution and discovery and the verification and decisioning, because also along that lines, you want folks to be able to say, I trust Salsa metadata that's perhaps coming from this location or coming from these specific keys and so on. I'm not going to talk about it too much. We gave a couple of demos on this, but Guac is trying to sort of solve that problem, one of those problems, which is sort of ingesting of all the public sort of Salsa metadata that's available, and other sorts of, not just Salsa, but other sorts of in toto based attestations and that kind of thing, and build a sort of sort of look at the graph of things and be able to say, okay, here's the metadata that's associated with these things, and from a verification and sorry, not verification, from a distribution and discovery perspective. But you bring up a good point that I think a lot of the policy stuff also is very much focused on just the sort of like, does the Salsa thing exist? Not really, what am I are there any higher level questions I can answer there?
Yeah, just
Isaac.
I'm so sorry, just to add to my point, if you don't mind, I apologize,
Sure.
Isaac, I'm butting in. One thing I'm thinking about is like, sure, like there's a happy path where, the SLSA metadata says it came from the repo you expect it to, et cetera, but like what do we do when it doesn't, right, come from the repo we expect, or that it wasn't built by, a runner that we expected it to be run by? That's an interesting question that I have in my mind. This is just kind of what I was trying to get at, I suppose.
Yep. Isaac?
Yeah, I had a quick question about Guac and then a comment related to something else you said. So in terms of Guac, I'm kind of getting up to speed with the scope and the intent there. My understanding so far is that Guac has been it was a kind of almost an offline intelligence thing. Are you saying that potentially it's a real-time decisioning thing for use in production? Like, hey, Guac could be part of an admission controller or something?
No. So just as a reminder, this is more for the distribution and discovery of the metadata. So the idea would be, so the idea would be, you can imagine, hey, we've collected all the metadata documents that folks are doing and put it into, and to be clear, all the public metadata documents, and sort of put it into a database that makes it sort of easy for folks to run those queries against. And once again, these should not be like real-time sorts of queries, right? That for like admission controls perspective, because we anticipate these to be, like potentially taking several seconds, or, for larger ones, maybe even longer. But the idea also would be folks could cache it and that kind of thing.
Got it. And then the other thing was just to kind of echo what you'd said about, verification and what that looks like. I mean, at the moment, like you say, it's the notion that we've had of it has been fairly shallow in terms of, hey, does a sign for false positives exist? I think we are going to have to, at some point, face what does the web of trust underlying that look like? And hey, if I'm an enterprise deploying this artifact and the provenance is signed by GitHub Actions, that's great. Do I trust GitHub Actions? What's the basis for that trust? Are there other enterprises that don't trust GitHub Actions, and so on? And then how do we provide anchors for that trust? Is that an ecosystem concern where people can say, hey, I'm going to go and verify these builders independently and attest to them? Or do we want to get into the business of having SLSA accredited builders, where someone actually goes in and says, well, the SLSA organization has said GitHub Actions is qualified at level 3 or whatever. And so at the moment, I feel like, we've not reached that point yet, but I feel like it's inevitable we're going to have to think through that class of problems.
Great. Sean?
Yeah, I think just to kind of build up a little bit on that. I think Shashank had brought some of this up before in an earlier community meeting, but I'm wondering now about kind of how do we go about working out who is trusted to do what in the chain, where there are multiple parties in the chain. Does it make sense for GitHub to be signing for package author, for package authors? Does it make sense, for third-party builders to be signing for things that they didn't do? Who do we trust to sign for what? I think is another part of the policy decision. So I think there's there's discovering that web of trust, but then working out what parts of the supply chain are members of that web of trust authorized to sign for.
Absolutely, and that it could be consumer specific, and so it could be that one organization trusts Builder X and another organization doesn't trust Builder X, or they trust Builder X at different SLSA levels. But I think that's absolutely on point.
But just also to remind folks, I think I think there is a lot of that sort of stuff that's already kind of being done from, there's a 6-door policy controller, there's Keyverno, there's OPA Gatekeeper, and some of these other tools that are kind of actually, doing some of that work and figuring out like whether it's through TUF or something else. Mark?
Yeah. So in terms of like what actually happens at, you know, like if on the path where things get rejected, I definitely think that is a good thing to work through, because like that's kind of the case that we're trying to do, right? Is like protect bad stuff from getting through. I don't know how you want to track this, Mike, or like how you want to like break this up into like sub problems. Maybe it would be good to like have someone, well, I guess it's kind of along the same lines as the policy question of which Vita and Simon had written up some initial thoughts on. Because I was about to say, like, I have some thoughts on how that might work, but then that might just be getting into the weeds now. I mean, would it be valuable to kind of talk through that, or like, is that just causing the conversation to go all over the place?
No, I think it might still be worth it. Oh, Roy, if you said anything, I think you're on mute.
I haven't said anything yet. I was waiting for Sebastian's turn. I was patiently waiting.
Okay. Definitely. I think it's a lot of all these questions are still open. But yeah, let's go through Sebastian.
Thank you. I wanted to bring the perspective that you have a list of tools that was on your screen, but I'll read it on my screen. So cosine, tough, guac, companion file. And for companion file, I don't think it's practical to expect package managers to support distributing these extra artifacts. It's definitely something that can be done for the large ones such as NPM and PyPI. But in practice, there are hundreds of package managers of various degrees of maintenance and quality. And it's not practical to sideload them either, because people do use them for better or for worse in critical projects. So I think the discovery of metadata has to be a separate process from downloading the package itself, in the same way that distributing GPG or SMIME keys, those kinds of things, those are done outside of the ecosystem which is trying to use the signatures. The keys are distributed through various different methods.
Yep, that's a good point.
I guess just to respond to that specifically, I have some opinions here. In my opinion, I think it'll be desirable to have both models. Doing it within the ecosystem is valuable for reliability, because when you have to do it through a separate system, you have a new failure domain. Like it used to be that, well, if you can't fetch a package if the mirror is down. But here it's like you can't fetch a package if the mirror is down or the provenance thing is down. And if you need some extra system to verify signatures, and if that system's down too. It also might add additional latency in order to fetch these attestations. And that might be undesirable in a lot of cases. Like within Google, we've run into that and specifically have built inline propagation of attestations. We've made that a priority for reliability and latency reasons. But for all the reasons you said, I think it's also desirable to be able to support other ecosystems that don't have that support. And so I feel like it's probably a mistake to only support one to the exclusion of the others.
Mark,
yes, I think that
there's a huge open question here as to, because package managers haven't adopted SBOMs at this point, even though we've all said that it's supposed to be there. The question is the SBOM validation of what its contents are part of the package manager, and the signature validation and CDEs or VEX checking outside the package? Those sort of discussions haven't even happened yet, right? Signing packages as they are now is not necessarily our end goal.
Sorry, I didn't quite follow what you meant, Roy.
So the EO is asking us for every package that's delivered to have an SBOM in it, which means NPMs, PyPy, VHDs, FFUs, you name it, the things we ship things around in. We don't have those for packages. Nugget doesn't have it, and VCPKG does not have it. The validation of what that SBOM is against VEX and communicating out to the network is still a work in progress of how the heck this is all going to flow through and how offline validation is going to work. So focusing on just signing of packages right now, I think is a good start. But I think we need to have the broader conversation of how do SBOMs end up folding into these. Which then get into the other question of, I can rent a factory to go and build my component. I still own the product at the end. And in theory, the way I vision that is the SBOM is owned by the product owner, whereas the factory or GitHub actions could potentially sign evidence that they saw during their build in their factory. And that is perfectly fine, right? It's the SBOM is the ownership declaring of the package, not the SLSA data, nor the other attestations. That's how I'm viewing it anyway.
Yeah, I think one element there is that if you rerun a build, you would expect to get the same SBOM, but you wouldn't expect to get the same provenance data.
And it's, well, if you're arguing that they should be able to have the same IDs, that's an interesting question. I think there are parts of an SBOM that are unique to that specific run. On the other hand, I think all the files that are deterministically built and all the rest will be 100% exactly the same. I agree with that point, but I don't think the SBOM is 100% reproducible at this point.
Yeah, and like you say, it's not necessarily ideal for them to be completely reproducible. You do want to have certain information about the specific builds to know whether the SBOM is what you expect.
Basically, I want to know what factory the ibuprofen or Tylenol was produced in, not dumb it down and say, hey, it was all done by the Bayer company. That said, the other comment saying, hey, specific evidence to a specific tool, my understanding is that we were allowing multiple tools to be able to claim the same, produce evidence that's sufficient, like CodeQL versus Coverity versus Prefast versus, they're all static analysis engines. They all should be able to say, hey, we can attest that we produce static analysis results that are looked at. I'm not looking at a specific SLSA entity being bound to a single tool at this moment, or are other people thinking this differently?
No, I don't think that's, oh, go ahead.
No, yeah, I agree. I think in SLSA, the tooling is not specific, right? Like you should use this tool in particular. You can use any tool. I mean, vulnerability scanning, you can use, there are hundreds of them. You can use any of them to scan for it. So, and I don't think it should be specific to any tool as such.
Yeah, and
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the SLSA spec has like, we have that builder element in there where the only thing that would be different is just like, yeah, you want people to know, as you sort of mentioned, Roy, like you want to know what did do the building, right? Like not necessarily just who built it, right? It's like, company X built it with tool Y, right? Or at least they're claiming that they built it with tool Y, which is also, I think, important.
The question of tools becomes really problematic, specifically for bigger companies. Google with their Clang using for Chrome isn't the same one as Clang that the rest of the industry uses, nor is Visual Studio compiler that we use for building Windows isn't necessarily a production version that are released to the public. So we haven't even worked through what that means. And then we're starting to trip into the GitBOM space as well. That one I think is worth a much deeper conversation, and considering build engines, and there is a concept of some ability to have IP in these processes. We have to tread very carefully in here.
Mark?
Yeah, sorry, I'm on the street, so if you can't hear me, sorry about that. So Roy, I agree. I think I as far as I understand what you're saying, I think I agree with you on pretty much all the points. In particular, like the difference between, like, the builder is claiming it produced this thing and that's about it, whereas the SBOM would be getting into the details of what went into it. And if we think about the use cases, SLSA, as written now, is worried about tampering, whereas SBOM is focused on vulnerability management and licensing. And so the threats are different there, like the threat actors are different. And so I think the two are compatible.
Yeah, Mark, the last thing is who owns and declares the SBOM on the product is the purview of the end person. The SLSA and evidence claims could be part of the factory, in which case has no relationship to the SBOM owners. I'm saying that the SBOM is where you would go to say who owns the product, and not look at this who signed the SLSA data as being definitive as ownership.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, we'll have to like write that up, but like at a high level, that sounds good to me. Although again, like it kind of comes down to the details.
Yeah, I understand. The other thing is distribution of all this content is where we start tripping into using Skit as a notary system and a public way to distribute large volumes of data. I think we've got OCI listed here, and that's similar to the thoughts and a stepping stone to a better solution going forward. The interesting question for us for packages is potentially the SBOM could be inside a NUGIC package or an NPM package. But as soon as you start trying to build complex products, you need some endpoint that you can go and retrieve the same SBOM from without having to say, I have to ship the whole tree inside my product myself. And so I'm kind of viewing SBOMs as being both an optimization that they're in the package so you can do it offline validation, and potentially be available through something like Skit or OCI to handle the deeply nested tree that we will end up building in the end.
Yeah, I have to step off the call for a second. I'll be back in a few minutes. One quick thing, in terms of like coming back to the storage thing of like, do you store it in the package repo versus have some like third party or like some alternate means of storing the attestations? I think if we think about use cases for SLSA, where we're trying to stop tampering and actually ideally would prevent package uploads and package use, there we have a higher reliability.
Mark, I think you.
It was a great ending statement for him to leave on.
Oh, it looks like Mark, you still there, or?
He probably stepped into a dark zone.
Yep. Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think we all sort of agree there. I think that there's two separate, yeah. And I kind of want to make sure that given that this is mostly focused on the SLSA stuff, I do agree that the SBOM stuff is going to be an interesting integration point. But maybe we don't have the same exact concerns, at least starting off. With that said, I think there's there was a lot of good points there around, especially around sort of that distribution piece, because I do agree that, whether it's Skit, whether it's OCI, whether it's a REST endpoint that gives you a sign, whatever. I think that there's where we're trying to kind of figure out the two big components of it, which is one is if somebody just sort of sits down and says, great, either I'm about to download a package, or I just want to do a lookup and I want to see, does this thing have SLSA metadata? What mechanisms can they begin to do that, right? Some of that is right, like if with OCI, it's a little easier because I could just look at the OCI registry and just pull down the blob I'm interested, like the salsa attestation, as opposed to needing to pull down the whole image. But then there's also talk around already some folks saying, hey, we're going to give access to some sort of database that contains this information, and you can request it through the hash or through some sort of URI.
So the thing I was trying to point out, Michael, is that though we've said SBOMs are everywhere, we're not treating them as ubiquitous as a building block for things like salsa to hang off of. And maybe if we just say, hey, this is our fundamental starting point, or something we can anchor against, things become a little bit simpler to walk through.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. So would you sort of argue then that like some of the work that's being done in the SPDX and CycloneDX and similar sorts of spaces around distribution of SBOM, some of that could be leveraged for also distribution of salsa metadata?
Yes, 100%. Because the reason that I bring that up is because there is one piece of data that I think will be continuous through the lifetime of the product, which is if I go off and say that I need to have an anti-malware scan within the last 7 days, that will be a continuous process, and that's new evidence per week, potentially, in which case it has to go out there. And I would love that to be, hey, here's what it is from a salsa point of view as raw data proving that we did it, right? So I don't necessarily say that all salsa data for a build is public, but things like anti-malware scan should definitely be on the, hey, the last one wins.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. There's also, and I don't want to get too deep into this piece per se, but I know that there's some discussion about, for example, if I do have an anti-malware scan, where does that show up in my salsa metadata? Like, and I know one of the things that we've been doing, just myself and my company, is because there's not a ton of in toto predicate types yet, is we've just been using the sort of salsa metadata as proof of if I have a malware scan, I can point to the salsa metadata for that malware scan to show the integrity of the actual scan I just ran. That might not be ideal long term. There might be a better sort of mechanism of saying it doesn't make sense to say something like here is claims about the security of a thing, and have a different, whether it's in toto or some other metadata type. That's something that
I was using it as a proxy for after the product is built, we will potentially gain new evidence. And alpha and omega CodeQL style work we're doing for OpenSSF fall into the same buckets. They happen after the product's been released. And so we kind of need to think that this evidence shows up both when we're producing the final product and will dribble in later. And I would love to understand what that is from a salsa point of view.
Yeah. So from the tooling perspective, I think the thing that we've been doing, and I want to hear other folks' opinions as well, is we've just been sort of associating this metadata as much as is possible, where we just sort of say, hey, if it's signed with the right sorts of keys, and we have, for example, if you use tough, right, we can go and say, okay, well, these keys are associated with these roles, and so they've been given permissions to sign these sorts of things. And then so at the end, we might expect, from a policy perspective, I expect a salsa metadata associated with the build. I expect a security scan, a signed security scan, or some sort of attestation regarding to the security scan signed with this role, and so on. That's just what we've been doing. But Mark?
Yeah, I think it's also something that we've kind of danced around before, but is coming to, I think, is more important to resolve now, is what is like strictly required by salsa versus what are like add-on benefits of things that we kind of like implementations ought to do to get more benefit out of it. So from the
required part of SLSA in what we currently have defined, not counting any sort of future extensions, is just about tampering and specifically how the thing was originally built. And so that information is, I believe, static and like won't change over the lifetime of the artifact. Like if you say this thing has to have been built from this GitHub repo, well, that doesn't change in the future. Future versions might be built by different things, but each of those would be a separate artifact with its own attestations.
Agreed, but that's like corollary to that is that's where VEX comes in. Hey, if they discover something after the fact, then you'll generate a CDE or a VEX saying, hey, there was a compromise we didn't detect.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think like if there's probably, you know, so that's kind of like all SLSA needs is like evidence that like some notion of where the thing was supposed to be built from or how it was supposed to be built and evidence that it was built that way. And then you do that check and you could continue to repeat that check just to like verify it. And you could do it on, you know, at upload time or use time or ingestion time into an organization or just monitoring. But effectively that all that data is static and it shouldn't change. Whereas like vulnerability management, which is outside of the scope of SLSA right now, but is related technologies would. And so I think that's maybe where some things are coming down of like certain folks have one use case in mind, like I'm having the tampering use case in mind and think, oh, well, this information's static. And then other folks are like, oh, the information I have is dynamic and it does need to change. And like storing it in the repo doesn't make sense because it has to keep changing.
I don't think I want to say it changes. I just think we have new, fresh versions. The old stuff is still there. It's still immutable, but I can give you a new anti-malware scan later on. And
yeah. I'm sorry. You're right. That's a better way to say it. So here's actually another use case that's a little bit in between would be, I want to say at upload time, prevent this upload unless it has been scanned and tested according to some definition. And in order to do that, you have to create the artifact first. And then you scan it. And so like it can't really go into provenance because like it has to go, like it's an after the fact thing. And in some cases, like you have to actually upload it first, like let's say a container image. Let's pretend you have to actually upload it to some sort of container registry before you can like scan it because that's the interface that things use to do scanning. Or let's say you want to run it on a cluster or something and say like, yes, I ran that in my cluster and all of my quality assurance tests passed. And that would be additional evidence that you generate after the original build. So it's similar to what you're saying in addition to like the regularly updated stuff. We should kind of come to an agreement on what we call that. In my mind, that is not strictly SLSA. It is related. And we probably want to create, when we create a solution, support both use cases. But I don't think it's strictly SLSA.
that's exactly where I was thinking, Mark, except the terminology I uses then is we look at the available evidence. We'll make an endorsement is available for XYZ. So in this case, it would be an endorsement that's available for testing. Next stage may be with the testing data, we make an endorsement saying it's ready for flighting. And after that, once that gets to some stage, you'll make another endorsement saying it's ready for release. And so it would be a staging. The evidence they look at and the gates, the levels they have to be at can be kind of sliding scale as they go along. And that's why we were basically saying, hey, endorsements need to be lightweight and consumable and not look at a broad swath of data for the consumers to make the decisions. And that's where the distinction between SLSA is about evidence and here's proof that matches to this this functionality, where an endorsement is saying, hey, I looked at it and I would claim that it's available for testing purposes.
Yeah, I think that what you mentioned there, at some level, it sounds similar to sort of like the binary authorization white paper, some of the other things that are kind of out there around sort of saying, like taking it, hey, based on all the metadata I have today, and all the affirmative metadata, I should say, right? Like everything should be affirmative. You should be able to say, great, no vulnerabilities have been discovered in the past 7 days, this, that, and the other thing. It gets a stamp, it's ready to go into whatever environment, or it's ready for whatever the next step is. I think that still leads to the other question of like, okay, well, before we even get to the point where we can sort of make that endorsement, we need to make sure we have that ability to provide access to all the metadata to whatever tool is going to be making that endorsement, or whatever thing is going to be making that endorsement, I should say.
It can vary. This is one thing I stressed before, is the endorsement doesn't have to declare what evidence or SLSA items it looked at to make its decision, because declaring what you didn't look at is a security issue as well as what you did look at. So to my mind, an auditor or reviewer can make an endorsement and not declare how they got there. And I'm 100%, as long as you understand the subtlety of what I was saying there, that building block allows us to have a sliding scale and improve SLSA as we go forward here. I still think the SLSA style data is the largest thing that reviewers would do, and not all reviewers will only base their decisions on the SLSA data.
Oh, no, yeah. To be clear, I completely agree with you on that one. I think that there's another subtle point, which is as we look at that sort of problem, I agree that certain people might not be sort of, if they make an endorsement, they might be not declaring how they made the endorsement, but there still needs to be a process by which how they make their endorsement. And for example, a lack of metadata should not be considered, like I think you had mentioned this, right? A lack of a vulnerability, or rather not looking for a vulnerability, doesn't mean the vulnerability isn't there. Right. And so there still needs to be that. That's all I meant.
Which then gets into the question that somebody asked me this week is, where are the SDKs to write out content types for attestations or in SLSA claims, and where is that showing up, and let alone endorsements, and we're going to get into the signing stuff. And so getting the large block of here's the SDKs that people can pull together is something I'm kind of interested in.
I think one critical aspect is having stable identifiers, and that's something that we've been very keen to do in SPDX. We've had identifiers on the document level and individual elements within that, and if CSAF documents can have similar identification mechanisms, then we can link the vulnerability reports to each other.
There's a little bit further on that you have to think through. Some of the distros cherry pick fixes against CVEs, so there has to be the other binding too, which is the SBOMs have to be able to reference the stable identities of the VEX items. Yeah.
So I think CSAF doesn't currently have a internal way of expressing IDs, but content addressable IDs are always a nice, easy way out of that if you're able to have machine readable rather than human readable identifiers, and the tooling around that to calculate the identifiers.
So now we have sort of 10 minutes here. So I think it's probably worthwhile just to kind of reevaluate. So from last meeting, we had sort of decided on taking a closer look at the distribution and discovery tools to see if there's ways that we can sort of either fill in some gaps where they might not exist, if we could start to sort of look at different approaches for some of that sort of stuff. It sounds like, based on what Roy had said, and I don't know, I've only been to a couple of the SCIT meetings, but do we know the sort of current state of things for, where we might want to start looking, even if it's not like a permanent solution, right? Or I don't want to say permanent solution, but like, are there certain things we can do today around sort of the distribution and discovery problem, or do folks think kind of like a lot still needs to get done?
Steve Glasgow put out a video on how to use OCI for this association as a stepping stone for us to start playing with. And I'll see if I can find that and broadcast that back out here. So it's perfectly available for us to start hooking these things together and use it as here, this is step 0.
Yeah. So just on that note, I believe both the ORIS/notary stuff as well as the other OCI and SIGSTOR stuff all sort of are using, because I think even today you can store SLSA metadata in OCI, but does I have a question, does that sort of also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
They already have a binding mechanism in OCI that would allow us to associate this joint data together, and that is what I was saying you use, not using necessarily the same support of Notary, but just say, here's the binding mechanism to search.
Okay. Yep, that sounds good.
And I would like to point out that the OCI way of doing things in the artifact registries is content addressable. And that's something to keep in mind. And I'm not suggesting it's good or bad at this stage, but content addressing is an easy way out of a lot of these stable identification problems.
I think maybe a good next step would be to start a doc where we could kind of start dumping ideas like requirements, considerations, use cases, possible solutions, pros and cons to those solutions, and then kind of like form that into something more coherent.
Sure, could definitely create that doc right now. I will just create a new one.
While you're doing that, Sebastian, how is the discussion of stable identities going? Have they pretty much settled, or is it still a hot debate at this point?
In terms of stable identification of software, the software packages themselves, there are still some problems due to the lack of maturity about those stable identification mechanisms, and that applies to both CPE 2.3 and Perls. And in terms of the stable identification of SBOMs, I think it's going very well. The SPDX 3.0 will have RDF-style IRIs. And I think the missing link there, in terms of not having stable identifiers at all, is the CSAF VEX side of things. There's stable identifiers for the where to get the new vulnerability reports from, but there isn't really, as far as I can tell, a mechanism to find stable identifiers for a specific advisory at a specific point in time.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I created the doc right now. Obviously, absolutely nothing in there. Probably worthwhile to for anybody who wants to just start putting in requirements, use cases, that kind of thing. I think it's probably okay to just start off with just brainstorming in there, and then next meeting we can probably get together and refine it a bit. Does that make sense, folks? With that said, I know we only have 4 minutes, but is there anything else anybody else wanted to bring up here? I think this was productive. I think there's a lot of interesting points that were brought up about making sure as they say, the devil's in the details, right? Like there's a lot of things that can get lost here. And I think a lot of this discussion brought up some pretty good points. If there's nothing else, we can end it 3 minutes early.
All right, thank you. Bye then.
Yeah. Later.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thought I'd follow you here, Mark. It's good meeting with. Thanks for being the inspiration.